you and welcome to the Dogwood Room. Today's verbal presentation will be on climate change, and really congratulations to everybody for making it this far. So really sticking it out, you know. But please welcome our first speaker, Katie from CU, Colorado.
I am impressed with this crowd on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't expect so many people in the room, but yes, thank you to the organizers and to you, the audience, for letting me present on my work with satellite data, in situ sensors, and machine learning to provide estimates and prediction of groundwater use in drought-prone regions as part of early warning, early action services for drought. So this work is motivated by the millions of people in the arid Horn of Africa that face persistent threat from a lack of safe, reliable, and affordable water. As many of you probably may know, the region is currently facing one of its worst droughts in over 40 years, where over 36 million people are currently experiencing the impacts of drought, which not only are limited water access, but also consequences to food security, livelihoods, health, and resource-based conflict. And unfortunately, drought is only increasing with climate change. Groundwater is an underutilized drought mitigation strategy in this region. The challenge is less about supply and availability rather than accessibility. Studies have shown that in Africa as a whole, abstraction rates are often well below annual recharge rates, and this is notwithstanding significant storage volumes that can be 300 to 400 times extraction. So instead, the converse statistic is that within 5 years, up to 25% of rural water supplies can be non-functioning after installation. And so what can be targeted instead for limiting groundwater's application to drought mitigation is poor water service management and delivery. This is centered within the Drought Resilience Impact Platform, or DRIP, our framework for water security during drought that recognizes the need for higher resolution water and food security monitoring, and then realizes that from individual site level data, we can create regional data products and tools that can enable pay for performance contracting and incentivize and improve operations and maintenance. The first point in that continuum is high resolution, near real-time in situ monitoring of water points in arid regions. There are over 600 boreholes in Kenya and Ethiopia being monitored by these sensors. These collect sub-hourly data on the amount of time that a pump is running, which can be used as a proxy for how often the water point is being used, as well as from estimates of flow rate, the amount of volume being extracted. From this data, local water managers and decision makers can look at the performance of individual water points, as well as the collection of infrastructure in their setting on percent of uptime, mean time to repair, and also look for trends over time that may indicate impending or confirmed failure of water points. This type of data can also be used to look at the relationship between groundwater use and other environmental variables such as precipitation. We have observed an inverse correlation between groundwater use and precipitation. As precipitation increases, groundwater use is used less, as people often prefer to collect water from surface water in this setting. It also relates to food security, and you can see that as precipitation decreases, groundwater use increases, as well as food insecurity. And so part of this work looks at how groundwater can be used during those times of low precipitation to mitigate food security. From the individual point level data, we can also look at groundwater patterns regionally by using the in situ data and creating a model based on explanatory variables such as precipitation, but others from satellite data, and site characteristics using a sophisticated statistical approach known as machine learning. So this is our output data or observed data alongside the input data. Many of these things you may be able to intuitively understand why they may be related to groundwater use. Precipitation I've already described, but also vegetation on the land surface, as well as things like stream flow or surface water availability, evapotranspiration, and then other explanatory variables related to social and political systems at the site. When designing our study, we also had to define a measure of high groundwater use that could be interpretable and actionable by stakeholders. So we created binary classifications of high groundwater use versus low groundwater use along three domains. One being mechanical, the mechanical burden on the pump of over a quarter of a day. And then the others relate volume extracted to population need based on population density. Either to groundwater being used to meet domestic needs or intermediate needs, which would include domestic and livestock watering. And these thresholds are based on the multiple use service ladder. The model is an instance of supervised learning, where we have a subset of data that is observed, like a subset of groundwater use data observed by the sensors, indicating whether use is above or below one of those thresholds. After a long process of data cleaning and exploratory data analysis, applying a well-suited algorithm to the study design and to the data itself, and being able to predict at sites where there is a sensor and is not a sensor, high or low groundwater use. So we have extended this estimate to places where there is no sensor, but also allows us to evaluate and validate the model when comparing observed known use from the sensors and our predictions. The algorithm that I've alluded to here is an Ensemble machine learner. It's also known as super learner, if you've ever heard that term. It is a way to apply more than one statistical approach to your data, such as anything as simple as a linear or logistic regression, but as well as non-parametric approaches, including tree-based methods, such as random forest or gradient boosting, and then other candidate learners, as the algorithms are also known. The model trains each of these algorithms on a set of data and evaluates it on testing data, and then creates a weighted average of each of the algorithms in a final model, so that you're able to leverage the advantages of each of those approaches, and allows you to be a bit more agnostic. The relationship between groundwater use and those explanatory variables is not very well known and characterized scientifically, but empirically, we've been able to take advantage of the relationship between groundwater use and those land surface variables. So this has provided high accuracy spatial and temporal estimates and predictions of groundwater use. These results are being shared on a public web-based dashboard for anyone to view, and then with our stakeholders, the main one being the Kenyan National Drought Management Authority. We've worked very closely with them to adopt this type of data into their early warning bulletins. Examples of each of those results on my right, your left, is a screenshot of the web-based application, which can be visited at that website. It shows estimates of groundwater use in 5 counties in Kenya since 2017 to present, and includes forecasts up to 4 months in advance. Through this application, users can look at each of the different definitions of high groundwater use, filter the data to their context, as well as overlay the sensor data to compare what's being monitored at the sensors and versus what the modeled groundwater use layer is indicating. If I've piqued your interest, I also encourage you to check out the publication on this work that goes into more detail about the technical aspects and acknowledge my co-authors on whose behalf I am presenting today. This shows the progression of groundwater use used to meet domestic water needs in the 2021 dry season. And it's probably too small for you to read, but with external validation, meaning with new data that the model had never seen before, we achieved accuracies of over 70%. And at this intersection of science and implementation, it's always important to remember stakeholder adoption and where this data actually ends up. So each month we prepare county summaries or summaries of the groundwater data for each county in this region, and not only provide the maps, but also estimates of the population numbers affected, either by magnitude or by anomaly. So looking at how high groundwater use compares in previous years over a longer term average and over the previous month. This information has been ingested into the early warning bulletins, which you see a snapshot of here, and is filling a gap about a water resource that was previously missing from these reports. So there wasn't much information, or there was no information about groundwater in these monthly summaries at the counties, which are reviewed by water managers and national and local stakeholders to allocate budgetary resources and to do longer term planning for drought. And so this information is interpreted alongside other indicators of drought, such as livestock health, precipitation itself, surveyed water access, and a lot of other different parameters. And so we intend for this kind of new novel data source to be interpreted into within a larger context and to fill a gap for our stakeholders. Mention my references, and then I think I have plenty of time for questions.
If you have questions, please use the microphone.
Hi, thanks so much for a great presentation. I have 2 questions. First of all, in your sensor data, how do you have to distinguish between low use, actual low use, versus the pump is broken and so it's not being used, but it's because it's broken?
Mm-hmm.
And my second question is, how do you expect stakeholders to use this information? So once they have the map that this is the high use area, what does that mean for them?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
So we've done a pretty extensive data filtering to remove the sites that we know are under repair or broken, either from field reports or that haven't been used for an amount of time where that would be unexpected. So right now, the region's under one of like an extreme drought, what I've already mentioned. So if a site hasn't been used in 3 months, we immediately just remove that because we don't know whether it's why it's not being used. Other kind of tangential work is trying to apply a different machine learning model to predict when pumps are not being used, whether they're broken or if they're not being used for another reason. And eventually this kind of work will be melded together. But right now it's just a lot of data filtering. And then how we anticipate stakeholders to use this information depends on whether we have a monitored sensor or a monitored borehole. So in areas where the groundwater model is indicating high use, yet the sensor data is indicating that the pump is broken or not being used, that would be motivation for the O&M teams to investigate that site, either repair it if they deem that necessary, or provide other action for that site, that specific site for itself. In areas where we don't have a sensor, we rely on a lot of local knowledge of these water managers, so they often know well where infrastructure is and how well it's functioning. And so then they can make that same kind of determination. And some examples would be either providing for emergency water trucking to areas where there's high groundwater use, but no groundwater functioning infrastructure. And then in the longer term, maybe siting new boreholes to increase coverage.
Take one more question.
Yes. Firstly, I want to appreciate the effort to use remote sensing data, which is really important for developing countries where data collection for groundwater is often really expensive. And the second, my question is related to stakeholder adoptions. In the beginning, you mentioned about the rate of extraction is really high, and the data is only related to groundwater use. And in my opinion, the most dangerous part of groundwater extraction is actually overuse and never really care about existing water availability. And usually to advocate for government, we need to see how much has been used, what is the rate, but also we have to compare with the groundwater availability by check the overall groundwater model and water budget. And if you consider that in your stakeholder adoption, or what process do you do for considering the water availability in groundwater? Thank you.
Yeah, so in Kenya, at least, studies have shown that there are adequate supplies of groundwater. So this area at least is not at risk of unsustainable use yet. Even in the last 10 years, there've been new water sources, groundwater sources that have been discovered that have can be anticipated to supply the needs of the population for over 70 years. And I think other authors, other than myself, have talked about this discourse of scarcity that's kind of pervading the use of groundwater in these contexts. I'll speak just to East Africa, but that it's not really warranted, that groundwater availability is not threatened everywhere, even though that's often what's talked about in the Western US or some more developed contexts. And instead, groundwater can be used to meet population water needs now because abstraction is low compared to annual recharge and existing storage volumes that are available. But you make a great point that should be part of the conversation as we're promoting further development of groundwater infrastructure. And there are other organizations that are doing more hydrological modeling about groundwater tables, groundwater existing aquifers, and groundwater sustainability. So this data source could be interpreted alongside those and should be. But right now, the concern for over extracting the aquifers in Kenya is not a concern.
All right, next up we have Allison from UNC.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay? I'm gonna lower this. Hi, I'm Allison Lee, and I'll be presenting on the work from Sarah Lebu, Valerie Bauza, Aaron Salzberg, and myself on enhancing water security and resilience in low and middle income countries. So in this presentation, we'll define water security and resilience, discuss the regional distribution of articles included in this review. We'll share our findings on identified risks, impacts, and adaptive strategies, and how these inform the design of our decision support tool. So first, to discuss water security and resilience. USAID defines water security as the adaptive capacity to safeguard and sustain adequate, reliable, and resilient quantity and quality of water. So we define resilience as a dimension of water security, specifically how water systems respond to unexpected conditions or atypical ranges, such as from climate change or population growth. So as climate change and population growth are examples of some of the risks becoming more pressing on water systems, we wanted to ask, how are drinking water systems in low and middle income countries adapting to unexpected, atypical, and unprecedented conditions to enhance water security and resilience? So to answer this question, we launched a critical review to investigate existing studies and guides in low and middle income countries within the past 10 years, examine how water security and resilience risks and adaptive strategies vary by region or context, and identify determinants for successful adaptation implementation in order to inform decision-making. So from our search, we found over 8,800-ish peer-reviewed studies and 114 gray literature documents from a range of platforms. And we ultimately chiseled this down to a quarter of these studies to only include articles that focused on adaptations and LMICs. So next, we'll discuss the regional and country distribution of included articles. So we wanted to highlight the global distribution of articles included in our review. So this map indicates countries of each area's studied area. So for example, if researchers in China did a study in India, the study would be mapped to India instead of China. And the categorization of LMICs and regions used throughout this presentation were defined by the World Bank. And since our study only investigated low and middle income countries, non-LMICs are hashed out in gray. Each World Bank region was assigned a different color, and darker hues on this map are associated with more articles that came from that country. So for example, the darker purple of Iran indicates a greater number of articles than from the lighter hues in the rest of the Middle East, North Africa region. So the highest number of articles from each region are called out within their article count. I know the font's a little small for a small screen for such a big room, but this distribution can help us identify regional and country biases by highlighting gaps in countries or regions with lower or absent representation. So for example, in our review, unfortunately, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa were absent from our study, and overall low numbers in Europe and Central Asia were seen. And there's also a significant skew towards China, with over twice the number of articles than the next highest country, India. And to briefly highlight the regional distribution of included articles, a majority of the articles in our study hailed from East Asia and Pacific, and a small sliver of articles came from Europe and Central Asia. And so these are just mostly to highlight potentially regional biases in our studies. And all of this will inform our next discussion on water security and resilience risks and subsequent impacts. So we defined risks as the unexpected or unprecedented pressures that may threaten water security. So we categorize these risks as environmental, including seismic, weather, and climate-induced stresses or events, and anthropogenic, describing human-induced water stresses. So while climate change is included here as an environmental risk, we also acknowledge that climate change is the product of anthropogenic activity, but it's categorized here it's categorized here primarily as environmental, since the outcomes pertain to weather and climate related events such as extreme rainfall events, drought, sea level rise. So we'll next show a bar chart to highlight the distribution of risks discussed in the included articles. So for example, starting with the bar for population growth at the bottom, here you can see number of articles citing population growth as a risk, categorized by region of study area, with red representing East Asia and Pacific, blue representing Latin America and Caribbean, green for Sub-Saharan Africa, gold for South Asia, purple for Middle East and North Africa, and teal for Europe and Central Asia. And we'll maintain this color scheme throughout the rest of the presentation. So looking at all of the risks together, population growth was the most cited, followed by drought and then groundwater overexploitation. So this chart highlights the risks that are more prominent in certain areas than others. So for example, while geogenic contaminants was not as included as much in the studies, it was most included in articles coming from South Asia, as many of these articles pertain to arsenic. So we then identified the impacts of these risks as indicated from the arrows. So to briefly highlight one of these pathways, we linked drought most closely to lowering river flows and declining groundwater tables. And ultimately, these impacts contributed to an insufficient water supply to meet existing demands. And our included studies discussed a range of adaptive strategies to improve water security and resilience, which we'll discuss in our next section. So we categorize the identified adaptive strategies into 3 primary categories: water supply augmentation, water demand reduction, and water efficiency and management improvements. So we'll describe the adaptive strategies in each category in this manner, highlighting the relative cost and relative water security improvements for each adaptation. And due to difficulties in accounting for inflation, currency exchange rates, resource availabilities, and water demand variations from the different contexts we were reading in the different papers, these costs and water security improvements are provided relatively with respect to the other adaptations. So the adaptations in this category of water supply augmentation focused on increasing water supply through rainfall, groundwater schemes, and water treatment or transport strategies. And so next we'll show the regional distribution of adaptations in the same manner as the previous chart. So for example, here for rainwater harvesting, this was widely reported in East Asia and Pacific, as well as Middle East and North Africa. And with all the adaptive strategies together, we can see some trends by adaptations. So following rainwater harvesting, wastewater reuse and desalination were the most reported adaptations in our review. Atmospheric water generators as a more novel and climate-specific technology was the least reported in this category. So next we'll describe adaptive strategies to reduce water demands. So these typically target user behavior to reduce water usage and to similarly show the regional distribution for these adaptations. From this category, water pricing strategies were the most reported, followed by virtual water trade, then public awareness campaigns. And finally, to discuss the water efficiency and management improvement strategies, these strategies range from nature-based solutions to stormwater management, reservoir management, and integrated water resources management. And in the same style of charts, we see that irrigation efficiency improvements and water reallocation were the most reported adaptations in this category for our review. And while I'm sorry to have breezed through these adaptations, we compiled thorough descriptions of each adaptation and how they're implemented across the different contexts from our review. And we'll include these descriptions in whatever we publish, but for the sake of time, we're going to keep going. So from the included articles, we looked into the enabling environments for each adaptation. And here we use the term enabling environments to talk about similar concepts as the accelerating framework from the Monday plenary or the state of drinking water talks. So it's essentially describing conditions that support the implementation of adaptive strategies. So for our discussed adaptations, we identified the following enabling environments: energy, institutions, social norms, financing, technical skills, monitoring data, and regulatory standards. And all of this was found to inform our decision support tool. So we designed a decision support matrix based on our review. And since this has small font, we'll try to break it down. So the inputs at the top of the table this include scale and scope of implementation, risks that inform decision-making, hydrogeological conditions, and enabling environments. So these are kind of vertically listed at the top. And so to zoom in on one example, here it's managed aquifer recharge. The applicable units for each, or the applicable inputs for each adaptation are indicated with little icons in the appropriate columns. So the adaptive strategies are listed in rows to help identify trends such as the range of adaptations that respond to water scarcity or the adaptations that may require a reliable energy source. But since the table doesn't really do anything on its own, we can use this table in the form of a tool using the inputs previously described. So our decision support tool is currently on a Microsoft Excel sheet to be interactive, where users can use a checkbox on the side to best describe their system's conditions. So here the inputs are informed by guiding questions to clarify the meaning behind the input names. So for example, these questions further define what we're really asking from the terms water scarcity and reliable energy source, for example. And ultimately, this tool outputs portfolios of adaptations based on system characteristics. So to give an example of how this works, I'll share the portfolio outputs for this series of conditions. So the decision support tool first provides a portfolio of what we'll call most suitable adaptations. So this portfolio includes strategies that align with all of the indicated conditions. So here, for example, that's rainwater harvesting systems, desalination, et cetera. But this tool also provides a portfolio that only aligns with the scope, risks, and hydrogeology. So we call this portfolio other adaptations for future consideration, I guess name pending. And so the text is small, so just to zoom in a little bit. Here, for example, managed aquifer recharge is suggested, encouraging the consideration of technical skills for hydrological modeling and monitoring data availability because, or because as the arrows are pointing to, these fields are unchecked. So maybe a user realizes they actually have data to inform the strategy, or they'll consider investing in the technical skills to get to a place where they can consider manage aquifer recharge. So similarly, this portfolio includes strategies implemented at different scales. Since we don't strictly define each of the scales, providing options outside of their indicated scales could be useful in case these adaptations are worth consideration and their context. So ultimately, we hope our decision support tool can be useful to inform investment and policy choices around water security and resilience. USAID, UNESCO, and the Pacific Institute have outlined steps for implementing programs for building water security. And we see our decision support tool assisting with step 3 of this framework by providing a portfolio of adaptive strategies according to system risks. So as we wrap up, we wanted to end on some key takeaways. We conducted a critical assessment of existing literature and LMICs. And from this, we evaluated the suitability of adaptive strategies for different contexts. And finally, we developed a decision support tool to help inform decision-making around water security and resilience. And just before we finish, I wanted to acknowledge Sarah Lebu, who was my partner in crime in all of this and couldn't be here because of timekeeping in another room. And of course, Valerie and Aaron Salzberg, Tara Lee, Kaylee, and Rita for their help on all of our full text reviews, the whole Water Institute team, as well as the World Vision team, specifically Justine, Peter, Alan, and Ben. And we listed our funding acknowledgements from NIOSH and World Safety Fellowship, or World Vision Fellowship, but thank you. And you're open to any questions. Hello.
Allison, thank you for that presentation. You packed a lot in about 10 minutes. That was
It's
good.
a lot. I apologize for the
No.
cram of information.
I'm Ray Norman with World Vision. I'd like to, since you looked at what so many LMICs may or may not be doing, I'd like to kind of pan out to the 40,000 foot view. I remember, we all remember 25 years ago, we all found ourselves scribbling in sustainability in all of our grant proposals and all of our articles because we knew it was important. We didn't really know what we were supposed to do about it, but we knew it was the byword. And today, I think we find ourselves in the same situation with climate resilience. You know, we use the term, but a lot of us, a lot of WASH stakeholders, and I think a lot of national governments, I wonder if we really know what we mean. For example, when we talk about WASH services or water services that are resilient. I was pestering Jennifer DeFrance, I don't know if she's in here, about this. Hey, there you are. After the session this morning. Do you have a sense that WASH stakeholders or water stakeholders, and especially national governments, really understand what they mean when they say, for example, when they use the term resilient water services? Do you think we've got our heads around it, or do you think we still have a long way to go?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure about national governments. I don't know if I can speak to that end, but I think from the range of articles we looked at, there is a common direction towards that. I don't know if it looks specifically like one thing. I think what we found is that resilience often looks like diversifying strategies. And so we've seen a lot of that in the literature so far, which is encouraging. And I think we're going in a good direction, but I guess it's a broad we in the academic sense of from what we've seen, it's been encouraging. Hi.
Hey, Allison. My name is Molly. I'm from Emory. Great presentation. I know we talked a bit about this yesterday at my poster, so I also do a bit of resilience work. And I think your question is also really important because I have also struggled a lot with that. Like, what does resilience actually mean? What does it mean in all these different sectors that fall under public health, that fall under WASH? So my question to you directly is, so I'm also looking at, how do we measure resilience? And in that goes, like, what is encompassed by resilience? So you looked at resilience as a component of water security or insecurity.
Mhm.
And I actually looked at it the opposite way, which
Right.
I know we talked about, that water security or insecurity is a component of resilience. I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit more about the thought process that y'all use to come to that conclusion? I'm definitely not saying that that's wrong. I think that depending on like your end goal, it like you can look at it from either way. But I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit about your thought process on how you decided that resilience would be a component of water security and like your definition of resilience in this context?
Right. Thank you for the question. So those unfamiliar, she had a poster on resilience yesterday. That was fantastic. And we had a little bit of a discussion of like water security and resilience and kind of how they fit together, like she asked. So yeah, so we started at the drinking water system level and was looking at water security, like what is water security? And we kind of defined it along 3 dimensions of reliability, resilience, and sustainability. And of those 3, we were most interested in looking into reliability there. And I think from what you were looking at from like either a community or household resilience perspective, like that a household and community's well-being is determined by a number of different things for it to be resilient. And like you were saying, like water security is just one of them. So it's kind of looking at like different end users of that. But I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you.
All right, please welcome Jesse from National Institute for Public Health and Environment.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Jesse Limahelu. I work at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. And I'm going to talk about climate change today, and specifically the ways in which it can interact with waterborne infectious disease and the progress that we're making on limiting the burden of them. So this is actually part of a much larger project. We're in the process of creating this kind of climate change and health information database. And we're doing this because we notice there's so much work going on in this field that it's very difficult to find the information that you're looking for. And we think this represents a kind of barrier for everyone working in the field, working to adapt to climate change, to access potentially important information that's already available out there. So we collected a bunch of literature about the quantitative health impacts of climate change. We did this through a systematic review process called the scoping review. And from papers that we finally deemed to be relevant, we extracted a bunch of information, and we're hoping to share this in this database. Obviously, climate change and health is a very large subject area, so we had to go through a lot of information to find what we were looking for. We started out with about 37,000 papers, and then we narrowed it down to about 1,000 to extract data from. And today we're talking about this very tiny piece of that huge amount of information, which is about waterborne infectious disease. We found 41 papers that provide some quantitative evidence on these impacts. And this is quite a manageable amount of information, right? So we can talk today about what evidence these papers actually contain about the impacts of climate change on waterborne infectious disease. So to start with a bit of an overview, what do we see when we look at these papers? Generally, they cover quite a small range of different microorganisms, most of them actual pathogens. They cover a similarly small range of diseases, but a pretty diverse range, so that's good. We have at least one study for each WHO region, but when we look at individual countries, we can tell that the evidence base for most countries is still quite limited. And there's also not so much evidence about specific locations, which are represented by the black dots on the map. Finally, we looked at the methodologies of these studies, and we can tell that researchers, they like to look at the future more than they like to assess what has already happened because of climate change. But I still want to start a more in-depth discussion with this last part of information because it's always good to reiterate that climate change is already impacting our health. And the evidence that we have about waterborne infectious disease show that it's also impacting waterborne infectious disease globally in a bad way. So it's increasing disease risks and disease burden. There's different examples I could discuss. One that we often like to talk about in the Netherlands, it's about the Vibrio species in our coastal waters. These studies look primarily at the European and the Northern Atlantic region. So we're talking about non-cholera species. But what these studies tell us, they say that climate change is leading to certain changes in variables like the temperature of the water that are favorable to the growth and to the spread of these bacteria. And so they occur in a larger geographical area, which means more exposure, which means more disease. And we're seeing similar developments for other diseases like schistosomiasis in China or legionellosis right here in the United States. But the bulk of the research, they look at future impacts. They want to tell us something about how climate change might shape our health in the future. And a general observation that I can make about this is that these impacts are often quite complex. We're seeing a lot of variability in the results, which means, for example, that if you zoom in to a specific region or you consider a specific level of climate change, the impacts might move in one direction or the other, or they could not change at all. So a little bit of an overview of this prospective evidence. The larger the bubble, the more evidence. We're not seeing a clear focus on a specific disease. And we're also seeing that while we're seeing a lot of evidence for potential increases in impacts, there's quite a bit of these variable results that I talked about. So I want to highlight a few aspects of this, because variable results, it implies that climate change maybe will not make everything worse. And indeed, we are seeing some results that suggest that some impacts could actually decrease under climate change. But these decreases, they're often part of a larger process. So we're seeing this decrease in one area and then an increase at the same time in another area. And this kind of dynamic, we see this often, for example, in diseases where an intermediate host is involved in the transmission process. So these could be snails, for example, in the case of schistosomiasis. And this is because these intermediate host species, they often have like a specific range of environmental conditions in which they feel most comfortable. And we can see in the figure, for example, this is about schistosomiasis risk in Eastern Africa. And at more extreme levels of climate change, large areas of this region will become less suitable for this host species, and so the risk will go down. And at the same time, we're also seeing regions where, regardless of the level of climate change, we're seeing increases in risk. So these areas are actually becoming suitable as a result of climate change. So really, while the net change might be a decrease in risk, actually we're seeing a kind of shift in risk from one area to the other. And this is, I think, a key challenge that we're facing with climate change, which is that some regions might be seeing new risks in the future that maybe they're not equipped to deal with, or that may not be familiar to them at all. Now we can go back to the figure and also note that we have not found any study that projects a consistent decrease. So, well, it's kind of unfortunate that, but based on the evidence that we have, it's likely that climate change will also exacerbate many impacts of waterborne infectious diseases. For some outcomes, this evidence is a little bit more consistent. So diarrheal disease, for example. But generally speaking, what this means for us is that climate change is really pushing back on the progress that we're making on reducing the burden of these diseases. We're seeing in these studies that climate change is a major driver behind many risk factors of these diseases. So we're seeing evidence that it could put added pressure on microbial water quality, for example. And we're seeing some evidence that increases in extreme rainfall events are maybe associated with an increased burden of some of these diseases listed here. There's one study that looked at the sort of development and climate change in a single framework. And this study showed that maybe while the overall trend in these diseases could still be going down. So the burden is decreasing. This progress could be slowed down a lot because of climate change. And this was quite a simple study. So it didn't really consider all the complexities that are involved in this process that could actually make it much harder to adapt to climate change in reality. And I think this is sort of an important point to make in general. Many of these studies, they are quite, I wouldn't say simple, but they use quite simple methodologies. They maybe present their results for a very large geographical area, so they're not very specific. They don't really provide quantitative evidence for the processes underlying the changes that we could be seeing. And what's also important to note is that the methodologies are often they're not harmonized at all. So comparing these impacts to each other is very difficult. We can't actually do this. So if you're looking to use this information, which I encourage you do, then especially for more practical purposes, maybe consider them to be a starting point for further research, for an assessment that is more specific to a local context, for example. And this kind of ties into some final points that I want to discuss with you. Many of these studies, they look at risks, but they don't look at impacts. And risks are not the same as impacts. We can actually avoid many risks from turning into impacts by taking adequate adaptation measures, which I think is a key challenge for the WASH sector, for the sector that many of us are in. And we've had some great discussions throughout the week about making the sector more resilient. Maybe Allison's work can help with that as well. But at the same time, I'm not always hearing climate change being a part of this conversation, perhaps in a way that it should be. And finally, maybe you were thinking about hoping to see some evidence about diseases that you're specifically interested in, and you didn't see it in my overview. And surely we've missed some evidence because of our methodological choices, but it could also very well be that there is no evidence about these diseases. A great study that was published this year has showed there are hundreds of infectious diseases that are sensitive to climatic variables or that have already been impacted by climatic events. And so the actual, scope of the impacts that we're seeing of climate change, including on these waterborne infectious diseases, could be much larger than would be suggested by the evidence that we currently have. So with that, I want to wrap up. I hope looking at this evidence, what you take away from it is that climate change is impacting these waterborne infectious diseases at the moment, and will continue to do so in the future. But many of these impacts, they are complex. We cannot really pull them together and say, okay, this is the largest impact, so this is what we should focus on. You should really look at this evidence on a case-by-case basis. And I think this represents a key challenge for this sector. We're seeing many impacts that could increase under climate change, and this is very difficult. And unfortunately, maybe some of you have read the news today, but we're really not on track to, slow down climate change anytime soon. So I think adaptation is really essential to consider. And we think that good information is very important to do this effectively. And I hope that through our work, we could make some contribution to this process. So thank you very much. I'm happy to go.
Hello, I have a question. I'm Julie from UC Berkeley. I've done some sort of related work looking at impacts of extreme weather on bacteria on hands and in water. So I know from that climate change and weather are two distinct things. So I'm curious, when you're looking for studies for your review, if you're specifically looking for studies that have some projection of climate impacts, or if it could also be like an association between temperature and a disease, or if that would not be included in this.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think this was a very conscious decision to focus only on climate change. There's more work out there that looks at like associations with climatic variables, but we really wanted to pull those things together because they don't really say the same thing. So the literature that we collected, I mean, in the initial bulk of 37,000 articles, there's a lot of like climate and weather stuff as well, but we really wanted to focus on climate change. So the long-term changes either that we've seen already or that are projected in the future. And so climate change, yeah.
All right, I have a quick sort of specific question. So you said your review focused specifically on Vibrio? Is that correct, or did I mishear that?
Vibrio. It was one of the pathogens that are in the literature that we found. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I don't know if you would know the answer to this, but I know that Vibrio can often go into like a dormant-like state where temperature impacts if there's a resurgence of, I know you said you weren't focused on cholera, but for example, cholera. Did any of the papers that you look at talk about how like water temperatures might then impact the resurgence of bacteria that might be in a spore dormant-like state? Sorry, I know that's a very specific question. I was just curious if you came across.
I didn't quite catch the last part of your question, but the studies about Vibrio, well, we have studies about like the non-cholera Vibrio species, but there's also studies about cholera, so it includes both. The studies about Vibrio, they are like quite technical assessments of how these different parameters are changing. So they don't just look at temperature, but also salinity and like the algae that they depend on to grow. And so I don't know the specifics of those papers, but probably there's more information in there if you're interested in it. Yeah.
Maybe I can put you after this. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. It was really, really interesting. A quick question. You mentioned that these results could be used as an inspiration to work more with adaptive wash strategies. But do you have any other outputs or sort of recommendations for what this means for implementers and people working on wash or climate change issues?
I don't think so. I think like the output that we're working on is we have so from each article we extracted lots of information. So from general characteristics to very specific the results that they actually found. We want to share those results to that database, and then it's really like for everyone to use. So I guess we started this process because we asked like local governments, for example, in our own country, what kind of information they needed to do their work. And one of the things they said is they needed more of an overview of the evidence. They needed more access. So I'm not sure how they will use the information, but we know that it's something that people would like to see and apparently need. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on in this field. And with climate change adaptation, like you can't just say like, oh, this is getting worse, so we're doing this. You have to know how things are changing or where things are changing. And maybe that information is already out there and then they can find it in the database. And if it's not, then it can also be like a signal to them or to researchers to start up projects that specifically look at the situation that they're interested in. So it could work both ways, I think. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all we have for today. So you guys survived Thursday.